Alright, so our ball milling is complete at this point. It ran about 18 hours to get it to the consistency I needed it to. And again, what you're trying to do with the ball milling is break down all of the raw ingredients and get them essentially to mesh together on a very, very fine level. And if you stop prior to that till it's the consistency of like a talcum powder, the powder will not burn very well. It has a lot of heavy sulfur fouling and whatnot, and just ignites very, very poorly. Peek inside here, the ball mill. You may want to have a respirator on when you open this up because the particles are so fine they will float in the air, so not a bad idea. Also, I'm wearing rubber gloves, which we're going to need for the next step, the mixing and graining. But you can see, rather than being covered in the powder now, the lead mixing balls or lead media are now sitting on top, and the powder is kind of caked around and on the bottom, and it's so fine it's starting to almost thicken and clump together. And that is when you know it's done. When the balls are sitting on top and the powder is not on top of the balls, you know that it is complete and ready to go on the next step. So what you will need for this next step is a spoon and something to mix. This is just a piece of wood whittled down. You'll need a ceramic or plastic mixing bowl. This is just a screen mesh with a crude frame. This is just window screen that we're going to use to grain it with. You can get different sizes of this, and that's what's going to control the size of the grain of your powder. We essentially have black powder now. This stuff will ignite now that it's been milled, and you do need to be careful with it. Again, don't have it around a heat source or sparks or anything of that nature. But in order to be used for gunpowder, it needs to be mixed together with liquid and grain. Don't try and use it in this form now, because this very, very fine powder form, it doesn't work very well. And if you fire it out of something like a revolver or whatnot, a cap and ball revolver, it can be actually a bit dangerous because it's so fine. Some of the powder can blow out before it has the chance to ignite, and then ignite after the gun has been detonated and surround you in a fireball. So important that you grain it, which is this next step. So you'll need the things I mentioned. You'll need some cookie sheets. And what I am going to mix it with, we mix it wet. This is just general store-bought rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol. It says 91%. I have this diluted. It's a 50-50 mix of water and alcohol. Some people prefer just using straight alcohol or denatured alcohol. They feel that it further helps break down the chemicals and get them to mesh well. Still, other people feel that if you mix it with straight water, it helps it grain better. I'm kind of experimenting between the two. I'm kind of on the fence, so some people go with a 50-50 mix, which is what this is, 50% alcohol, 50% water. And we're going to go about mixing this into sort of like a lump of bread dough. But the very first thing we're going to do is put our screen over our bowl. And we need to filter or screen out the mixing balls from the powder, the loose powder. So I just take a little spoonful, put it on there, and then just gently push it back and forth. And the powder will go down through the screen, and the lead mixing balls will remain on top. Okay, so just to show the effectiveness of this stuff, that we have indeed achieved black powder. This is some of the dry dust prior to milling, but even at this stage it works just like black powder, as I will demonstrate. Now that's a little slow by black powder standards, but after we grain it, it will vastly improve. So once it's dried out, I'll show you the finished product. Alright, so now that we've got the powder and the lead media separated out from the actual powder, you might have a clump or two of some of the raw ingredients that or solid or a little piece of charcoal. That's why you use the screen. You can filter those out. And now we have black powder that's the consistency of talcum powder. It's very, very fine. Be careful with it at this stage. Again, it's gunpowder now, and you can't ignite black powder obviously, but we're getting ready to mix it with alcohol and water, so that will reduce the danger scale down a bit. But when you are mixing this up, it's sort of like mixing up concrete or joint compound for drywall, a little bit at a time. You don't want to turn this into a slurry. You are looking for something that's sort of the consistency of wet clay. That's what we're going for, because that's further helping mesh these ingredients together and is necessary for the graining, which we're going to do next. So I am wearing goggles, not a bad idea when doing this. And we'll just dump a little bit in at a time. Okay. And you can use your gloves or a spoon or a spatula and just kind of like you're making a cake. See, we're kind of clumping up there, so it's way too dry at this stage. A little bit at a time. And it's starting to look better. Starting to look like clay, which is what we want. So I'm going to keep mixing this for a few minutes and I'll show you the end result. So you can see now at this point it kind of has a slight shine to it, and it has kind of the consistency of clay, which is perfect. So what I'm going to do now, if you recall logwood, that thickening agent, I just lightly dust it, and sort of just like, again, I'm baking a cake or some bread dough, and gently knead it in. Alright, so I got this just a little bit wet, but it'll dry out okay. I've divided it into two pieces, so you can see it's sort of just a lump of clay. I've got our mesh screen over a cookie pan, and what you're going to do to grain it is, you're not going to really push it through, you're just going to kind of drag it. Like so. Just drag it, rub it through with your fingers in a dragging motion. And that's making little granules as it pushes through the screen. And it'll kind of stick in the screen, but don't worry about it, just push it back and forth. You can do little pieces at a time if you want. It's a little easier if it's a little drier. Like I said, I got this batch just a hair wet, but it'll work. Again, keeping the mindset of small batches, so we separate the full amount of powder as it's drying. So continue on with that till you've got it all fully grained. Alright guys, so this is what the powder looks like as it's drying out. This is half of the batch that I made. You can see all the little granules as it's drying. It's a little coarse. This is like, it'd be akin to 1F with some 3F mixed in, and because I got it wet, it's kind of wanting to clump together in larger granules. So as it dries, I'll probably just take a knife and gently chop it. It's not hard to do. It doesn't take very long to further break it up. But as far as drying goes, put it in a warm, again, nowhere near a heat source, but a warm, dry place. And if you've used water, it'll probably take a day or two to dry out. Alcohol, usually by the end of one day, it's fully dry. If it's sunny out, which today, the day that I made this stuff, it's not. It's gray and raining here. You can just set these out in the sun. Obviously, make sure that it's not around where any children could get to it. But if you stick it out in the sun, it dries really fast, a few hours, and it's done. So we'll go ahead and let it dry, and I'll show you the finished product. This procedure, this graining, commercially made black powder utilizes what some people call pressed black powder, or a method called corning. And you take the wet black powder and you place it in a die, and you exert many tons of force on it, and you press it into little pucks, and that process generates gunpowder that is stronger, provides more lift, It's not necessary. It will make stuff that's more akin to commercial powder, but as far as function and ignition and just being slightly below commercial powder as far as strength, which I'll talk about more later, this stuff does a pretty darn good job. So corning is dangerous. It involves more specialized equipment. It's not 100% necessary to make good quality black powder, so not necessary, and just in case you've ever heard of it and wondering what it is. But anyway, we'll continue to let this dry and I'll show you how it performs here next. Okay, so at this stage I've let the powder dry now for 24 hours and it's thoroughly dry now. It will take on sort of a dark gray color as opposed to a jet black, as what you see with commercially made powders, but it came out really well. It granulated really nice. The grains are nice and tough, which is good. And ignition on this, which I'll demonstrate in a second, is right on par with commercially made powder. It flashes instantly, which is what you want. You don't want a slow burn on it. You want it to flash. So ignition will be instantaneous. And hopefully it went well for you. And we'll go ahead and demonstrate not only its flash, but I have a little cannon here that I'll demonstrate it actually detonating. So that's next. So for a little flash test and comparison, over here on the right we have a pile of commercially made Goex, and over here on the left we have a little pile of our homemade black powder. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate the Goex first. And you can see that was pretty much on par with the commercial stuff. It flashed every bit as quick. And one thing you can do and test to make sure your powder is burning right is put it on a piece of paper or tin foil, and if you light it and it burns holes through it, it's probably hasn't been milled long enough, because powder that hasn't been milled long enough will take longer to ignite and consequently generate more heat, which is bad for several different reasons. Makes more fouling and whatnot. So that's a good way that to indicate that your powder is flashing instantly. It doesn't have time to generate a huge amount of heat. So that's one thing you can do. Alright, so next I'll go ahead and demonstrate this stuff actually being detonated out of a little black powder cannon. So that's next. Alright guys, so I've got a little miniature cannon here that's actually can be live fired. It's built for it. And we have this cannon loaded with about 35 grains of our homemade powder and some wadding, along with a little cannon fuse. So we'll go ahead and light it and see if we can generate some smoke fire noise. Alright, so in closing, I thought perhaps you might have a few questions about some of the particulars of this gunpowder, as far as how it's made, why I make it, how it's used, and whatnot. So just a few that I wrote down here. One question probably a lot of people have is why not just buy it and go through all the hassle of making it? Well, around here, black powder, genuine black powder, not Pyrex, is getting harder and harder to find. And the stores that do carry it, they're wanting more and more money for it. Not that I'm trying to put people out of business, but one particular black powder supply company that's online, most of their powder right now is back ordered, so it's hard to get. And to just buy 1 pound of powder, I went ahead and added to cart and ran through all the shipping and everything. And with all the hazardous fees and shipping, it was going to cost over $50 to just get 1 pound of powder. You can get a little bit of a price break if you buy multiples, but that's pretty darn expensive. So for a product that's getting harder and harder to find, for me, it made sense to go ahead and get into making it. Another big question, how much does it cost? Okay, so this is something that's
you'll be pleased to hear. For 1 pound of powder, it depends a little bit on how you go about getting your ingredients. You know, do you get a good deal on one or many of those ingredients I talked about? Are you going to make your own charcoal? But I've got my powder cost to make 1 pound of powder down to under $3 a pound. So that's dirt cheap shooting. You can just burn it for fun if you want to at that price. But again, it depends on how much you pay for your ingredients. If you look around and get good deals on things right now, since a lot of these products are fertilizers, you can get them at a good price because they're very plentiful in garden supply stores and whatnot. So this is very economical to make and shoot, dirt cheap. So that's another reason. Another question is this powder as powerful as store-bought black powder? No, it is not. You have to up your powder charge a bit to get the same performance. So I test fired some of this a few weeks ago and found that I typically shoot 50 grains of 3F out of one of my rifles. I was having to put about 70 grains in it to get roughly the same performance. Now, because this gunpowder is so cheap, that really doesn't bother me. I don't mind adding just a little bit more to get the same performance. So for me, that was no problem. And on a historical note, which is kind of cool, this type of powder is the way that it was produced prior to the War of 1812. As far as the way it's mixed and grained and whatnot, and consequently the performance, I've read about powder charges that were used in the Revolutionary War, and they were pretty darn big. In some cases it called for 160 grains of powder for a Brown Bess musket. But if you think about it in terms of this type of powder, that makes a lot of sense because it's not as powerful as commercially made gunpowder that you get today. It's every bit as fast, it's lightning fast. You get the same effect all across the board. You just have to up your powder charge a bit. Another question you might have is, how is it on fouling? You know, is it like glue after a few shots? So far, the testing that I've done is it's on par with GoEx. It's not quite as clean, obviously, as Swiss powders, the premium powders, but it's no better and it's no worse than GoEx. You know, you go to clean this stuff out, the first few patches are pretty messy, but no better or worse than GoEx on the fouling. Another question might be, can it be used as priming in a flintlock? And yes, absolutely it can. I tested it, and ignition is instantaneous out of the lock of a gun. So yeah, you can prime with this stuff, absolutely. One last question, can reenactors use this powder? Is it good for just dumping a load down and blowing it out in the air for the smoke, the fire, and the noise? Yes, it is. I dumped a charge down one of my rifles that was nothing but powder. I didn't use a wad or a ramrod, just dumped it down there, tapped the butt of the gun on the ground a little bit, and it went right off with plenty of noise, smoke, and fire. So yes, this is a great choice for reenactors, because as gunpowder becomes more difficult and more expensive to get, this is a great option for you. So that's some of the questions I thought you might have. If you have others, please feel free to post them. This is an ongoing experiment. I may even tune it slightly one way or the other. In our next video, we're going to actually be doing a lot of testing and firing live rounds with this gunpowder to see how it works. Maybe a couple of different guns, do some ballistics tests, some accuracy tests, and just really put it through its paces and see how it matches up to commercial powder. So once again, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate your support. If you are going to attempt this, please be very careful at the end of the day. Very doable, and it is safe, but you need to take precaution and use common sense and just really watch it and make small batches like we talked about. So thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, take care.